Welcome and good afternoon to this webinar on mission-oriented innovation. It's called Acting on Mission-Oriented Innovation, Where Next? And it is jointly hosted by the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, the OECD Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation, and the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. The purpose of today is to explore the challenges in mission-oriented innovation. We see that many public sector organizations are adopting this approach, and the challenge lies in operationalizing the ambitions and experimenting with making missions work in practice. So today we are looking for insights on practical implementation of this approach, especially concerning the long-term governance of missions. The agenda of this webinar is that we will start with some presentations from speakers from the OECD on the mission-oriented challenges in practice. And then we will move on to a panel discussions on organizations working with missions and how they are finding solutions. There is a chance for you to ask your questions at the end of the webinar, and we will close at around 2:30. The OECD team working on missions is Angela Hansen. She's the tools lead at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, also joined by Benjamin Kampf, the head of the Development Innovation team. Pert Tonerist, she's the innovation lead at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. Philippe Larue, project manager of mission-oriented innovation policies at the Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate, and myself, I'm Chiara Bleckenwegner. I work on mission-oriented innovation at OPSI. To start us off, I'll hand it over to Philippe.
Thank you very much, Chiara, and thank you all for joining. This is great to see how many people are here and are interested in this new policy approach. I see that we have about 130 and it's still climbing, so it's great again to have you here. I think this new initiative, this mission lab, is in fact very good news on different grounds. First, it reflects the fact that mission orientation has progressed. I mean, there has been many experimentation, many pilots, and also fully fledged in mission-oriented policy initiatives and mission-oriented innovation initiatives in different countries. And this is great. There has all these initiatives have progressed. They have learned, and there is already a lot to offer in terms of good practices. And the other good news is that OECD as well has progressed in its understanding of this type of policy approach. We've been looking at everything that have been out there on the ground. We learn about good practices, and we are here now ready to really support in this Mission Lab initiative, support this practical implementation. And as you know, this is a systemic policy approach, and so the range of needs, and this is what we will explore today, the range of needs that underpin the implementation of this approach is so broad that we thought that we would need to team up, and this is why we have now this cross-directorate initiatives. But we can go, so the last good news maybe that I will not present all the results of our projects. We will just allude to some of it, and especially what we will try to show is really what are the challenges that underlie that policy approach. What are the questions that mission-oriented policy practitioners are really facing today? If Chiara, if we may go to the first slides. Thank you very much. So just to know that everybody, we all talk about the same thing, let's have a look at how we have defined with all countries, with all policymakers, how we came to that consensual definition of mission-oriented innovation policy. For us, it's a coordinated package of policy and regulatory measures that are tailored specifically to mobilize science, technology, and innovation, and even more, of course, in order to address societal challenges. And all this package of measures, it's not an individual measure, this package of measures spans several stages of the innovation cycle. They use different instruments, policy instruments, from supply side to demand side, even regulatory measures, top down and bottom up. They cross different policy fields, different sectors, different disciplines, and all this is targeted toward ambitious and bold and concrete measurable goals to be met in a defined time frame. Thank you. And if we look a little bit next slide, please. If we look a little bit more inside that definition, we see that we have really three main dimensions of mission orientation: the strategic orientation, the policy coordination, and policy implementation. And within each of them, there are specific challenges, specific questions. Please, next slide, please. So if we start with strategic orientation, maybe the main question, if there is only one here, and we try to encapsulate all the questions, it's really how to create a broad consensus on those selected societal challenges and how to translate them in clear and bold objectives and how to address them. You need that consensus, you need that legitimacy. And those questions that might be underlying is really how to create customized, tailor-made missions for each of the specific situations. And as you can see, or maybe you cannot see, but on the graph on the right side, you see just selected missions in the health area. And some of them are, you will see that they come in very different shapes and forms. So the question is how to codify the right mission. And the right mission really is context dependent. So it's in terms of scope, it's in terms of depth, granularity, the focus, the boldness of these missions. Also how to secure and balance the involvement of all this range, this wealth of different stakeholders, from politicians, experts, policymakers, and what are the consequences of that in terms of maybe dilution of mission, because the more you take on board new actors, the more you risk the inflation of mission or the dilution of mission, how to go beyond the usual suspects, including citizens, etc., etc. These are questions that we have seen and that we have heard in our discussions with policymakers over and over again. Next question, next slide, please. Now, the second dimension, policy coordination. Here, the issue is that the main challenge is really how to coordinate those public and private actors beyond all those silos that I mentioned, disciplinary, sectoral, policy silos, and all these to go in the same direction toward the achievement of those commonly agreed missions. And the question is, some of the questions, and there are plenty of others, how to engage policy bodies beyond the STI area. All these initiatives have been led by the STI, research innovation ministries, agencies, how to go beyond that. And we know that to deal with societal challenges, we need to take on board far beyond that towards sectoral ministries, regulatory bodies, etc. How to coordinate all these actors across the different level of governance, etc., etc. You see the questions. I don't go through all of them. You really need to set up a governance structure, and you can see on the right, this is the governance structure of the mission-driven top sectors in the Netherlands. You can see that the main message of this graph is that it can be pretty complex and that it requires a lot of understanding and a lot of negotiations. Please, next slides. The last dimension now, policy implementation, because it always comes down to implementation. If it's only a strategy or a roadmap, this is not a mission-oriented innovation policy for us. It has to go down to the level of implementation. So, and here the question is how to implement those packages of complementary policy and regulatory instruments to achieve those commonly agreed objectives. So some of the questions relate to how to connect in practice supply side and demand side instruments. We will hear from RCN in Norway that they have tried to do that, and this is of course challenging. You see on the right hand side, the graph is just a schematic figure that show how the pilot E scheme in Norway is trying to bring together the portfolio of 3 agencies to cover the entire needs for consortia across the innovation chain. How to manage solution portfolios. You know that these missions are supposed to be solution neutral. They pick the problem, not the solution, but how do you deal with that in practice? That requires many changes. How to monitor and evaluate these systemic policies. These are, I just wanted to show rapidly some of the different facets of challenges and questions that arise when you do in practice mission orientation. And of course, the mission lab, the objective of the mission lab is to help the policymakers and all stakeholders involved in these policies to deal and face those questions and find practical solutions. The next slide, please. Sorry. So maybe I didn't want to end only with questions and challenges. I wanted to show also the bright side of mission, because there is one, otherwise we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't try to offer our service and competencies and knowledge on that. It's really those mission-oriented innovation policy, they offer a dedicated and tailor-made space for collective action that to take place, and and that is really adapted. These collective action schemes are adapted to each area and institutional setting. As I said, they are very context dependent. So they allow in this space for collective action, they allow to co-create the objectives and the target, to set up a specific structure of governance, and to design and implement an intentional policy mix. So it's a challenging, really challenging systemic policy approach, but it's to be developed gradually through experimentation and learning. So there is no syndrome of too big for me. There is, when we look at how countries implement this mission and how different type of organization try to implement mission orientation, they really start with early steps, and it's not like something that you have to do all at once. It's really something that is very gradual. You build on what exists, and you learn at the same time that you implement. And this is the process that this mission lab wants to be part of and engage in. So, and there are many initiatives to learn from, and we are happy to be with you today. And I hand over to Chiara again. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Philippe, for this overview on missions and some of the key challenges. And we'll move on to a question to you, the audience. This is an interactive tool called WooClap, and it's a way for us to understand what your experience is with missions and what your needs are. So I would invite you to connect to WooClap via this link. It should be pasted in the chat. Once you are on the link, you will see a question appear. The question is, do you work with mission-oriented innovation? Yes, no, but considering it, or no, just curious. And we'll leave you a minute or so to log your answers. It's great to see that most people seem to already be working with missions. It's great. I hope you'll find the panel discussion really insightful. Great, and somehow just curious. Great. Leave you 5 seconds or so. You can still answer the question while we move on. And I think I'll hand it over to Ben for a perspective on low and middle income countries and missions.
Thanks, Chiara. Good afternoon from Paris. It's really good to see that so many of you already work with missions and others consider it. I work for the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate and lead the Innovation for Development facility. We work predominantly with members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee on advancing innovation for development efforts and investments, particularly also through a diversification lens, and that includes advancing work on missions. Right now, we are working on a paper to further distill lessons, what works in implementing missions in low and middle income countries with the University College London Institute for Innovation for Public Purpose. And today I'll share a couple of analytical insights that we have. And Philippe already mentioned the Mission Actions Lab. Pierrette, who will be following my presentation, will share more details about this initiative from all 3 directorates. And I will focus mainly on some of our initial findings from the ongoing research on missions in low and middle income countries to further provide you with a frame of what is different and where are similarities. Next slide, please, Chiara. To preface, the premise of our work is that countries, be it high, middle, or low income countries, share really important characteristics when it comes to addressing complex challenges, albeit very different in scope. What we found is interesting and relevant to differentiate is to separate missions across challenges. We see in the international development sector, missions addressing complicated and addressing complex problems. A mission addressing a complicated problem is, for example, the fairly recent mission that is led by UNICEF, ITU, and other partners on connecting all schools worldwide to the internet. The framework is GIGA, and it's nested within a larger systems innovation initiative, also led by UNICEF, on reimagining education. So that's very much about accelerating progress against specific goals. And another type of mission is one that addresses complex challenges, as Philippe said, is one of the major characteristics and really then opens the challenge to work across sectors. One example would be, as you see on the small image below, the Family Planning 2030 mission, which is derived from an earlier mission. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals 3 and 5, already make reference to safe access to family planning methods for adolescent girls and women worldwide. And in 2012, a mission between multilateral organizations, bilateral governments, many governments in low and middle income countries was agreed to provide 120 million girls by 2020 with safe access to contraceptives. That mission wasn't achieved, but as you can imagine, that is a complex problem. It necessitates not only technical innovations in terms of contraceptives and shaping markets, but also changes in gender norms and notions about family. And another important differentiator is about the scale, differentiating between global missions, thinking of Gavi and providing safe access to vaccines for children worldwide, or national place-based missions, often also on the city level. With one example would be the mission in Colombia to provide fiber optic cable throughout the country for reliable internet access throughout Colombia. And that lends itself then also to just thinking about who is involved, because a massive additional layer of complexity in international development is, of course, the involvement of bilateral development providers, multilateral institutions, including international financial institutions, and of course, national governments, social movements that all have an element to say, so to speak, sometimes in the mission formulation and of course in the mission implementation. And I'll go into a bit more further detail with the next slide. Following Philippe's structure, the first point on strategic orientation that is really important to note when we speak about international development is, of course, the degree to which the mission is localized and really owned by national actors. Government, cross society could be a result of social movements, to what degree it might be coming from external. As you can see here, there's a quote from our forthcoming policy paper, and that's a really important consideration for international development, evidently. The second one is the mission needs to be, to a degree, reflecting the capabilities and capacities of the national innovation ecosystem and its components, and thus also then reflect the degree to which tech transfer models need to be an integral part of that mission, which is a huge differentiator between a mission in a high-income country, where we can assume that the capabilities of the national innovation ecosystem suffice to drive that mission. Next slide, please. In terms of policy coordination, the big element here is that we, of course, already have established policy coordination mechanisms in international development. Think of the UN coordination system, of poverty reduction strategy papers and implementation mechanisms, or even the humanitarian cluster system. And what each mission in every context will have to answer is whether the existing coordination mechanisms of the international development cooperation system and/or the humanitarian system and the national government coordination system are fit for purpose to actually advance cross-sectoral work that doesn't fall into isomorphic mimicry, which is really mimicking approaches that are coming from elsewhere without undergoing the deep institutional transformations and transformations in coordination processes that are really necessary to drive a mission. And that lends itself to the last challenge I want to highlight. Next slide, please, Chiara. On the policy implementation. Arguably, a challenge also in high-income countries is the projectization of work to advance social environmental goals. But of course, that's very, very accentuated in international development cooperation. And that means a number of things. One is it's a real problem to secure long-term commitment. Even if a mission would be national, very owned and driven, there is this uncertainty whether international multilateral actors and development providers will continue to support the implementation of the mission due to essentially development fads and just changing priorities in the global north. And it also lends itself very much to a bottleneck, which is established practice in the projectization of development, which is to essentially go with one implementation. But a big premise of mission-oriented innovation is, of course, the investment in competing solutions to drive change in different sectors, to then overarchingly contribute to the mission goal. And that is very much an element that needs massive reform in international development. So these were some of the specific elements that we are seeing that require nuanced approaches and different approaches compared to missions in high-income countries. And fortunately, we've seen good emerging practice, particularly in, for example, implementation of the mission on family planning that I mentioned, or in the place-based mission, often on the subnational level for circular economies. And we'll hear another example on this from the UNDP speaker today, Ida, with an example from Vietnam. And with that, I'm going to hand back to you, Chiara.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to ask you, the audience now, where do you think you are most in need of support? So I'd ask you to go back to the WooClap questions. You can reuse the same link as before. It should be in the chat. Does this resonate, what you have heard from Philippe and Ben so far? Or in what ways do you, implementing mission-oriented innovation, need most support? You can submit several answers. You can submit one answer at a time and then just go again as many times as you want. And I hope that the technology will work. I can see some people are accessing it, so wait for the first responses to come through. I'll refresh to see if it works. Okay. Well, it's not showing up for me, but no matter. Please feel free to continue to reply. In what ways do policymakers implementing mission-oriented innovation most need support? Then hopefully you will be able to see the results on your own phone or a laptop, even if we can't see it. So moving on, Pirat is next going to talk about how the OECD might help with those implementing missions.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Thank you so much, Ben and Philippe, also leading the way into this discussion. And I think I'll start off with one of my favorite sayings from a Finnish policymaker who says that implementation is where good ideas go to die. And I think that we are literally in the mission space, exactly in this kind of space where we are kind of seeing that missions are really, really important. We're facing really big missions that need to be solved and need to be tackled on the ground. And yet we haven't actually thought about how to make things actionable and how to make things actionable on the ground. So we are moving very ambitiously ahead, but we're kind of stuck also in old systems, silos, structures that are meant to actually deliver for a different type of policy making, for a different type of policies. So we see that, you set missions, but then the procurement system tells you how you can actually do things. Or you try to do things, but on a problem-oriented way or a user-oriented way, but then you really see that the problem is actually divided, or the mission is divided between so many partners inside government and externally, that you have to actually bust silos and go beyond. But what are the means or the abilities of those working with missions to actually go beyond those kind of governance structures that are not maybe fit for purpose or fit for missions themselves? So this is something that we really want to ask and really want to tackle together with the 3 directorates. So we are also in the kind of the mission to bust silos inside the OECD. And if you go to the next slide, Chiara, then our goal is to actually create a missions action lab based on these types of questions. So we want to actually kind of put our skin in the game and participate in the missions-oriented approach, and actually really work on the challenge of operationalizing missions and missions in practice. So we don't end up with a nice concept that didn't really realize its potential after 5 or 7 years of practice or meager results, and then we go on with something new and exciting again on kind of these logo types as well. So together with the 3 directorates, we want to actually set up something that participates in mission creation and has a cross-disciplinary collaboration across countries as well. So working on an action-oriented approach to in this kind of mission space. So if you go forward, then we at the OECD and at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, we have already started to work. So we have already run several simulations, and we have already run boot camps. We have tried our space also in capacity building and also setting missions in some countries over the 2-year course that we're working on this. And we're also working on kind of a systemic review at the moment in kind of everything connected to missions and missions governance specifically. So more to come on this on policy briefs and reports by the end of this year. So we will have also a portfolio of knowledge coming forward in this space. But specifically what we want to do with the lab, going to the next slide, we want to basically select 3 to 4 demonstration cases across different mission areas and types and countries, starting from next year onward or even autumn this year, and really work on the ground on those missions to actually on the delivery in terms of the products and services that we have developed already, but also testing out new ways of doing things and new ways of coordinating, new ways of governing missions on the ground. But we, of course, don't want to only work on those 4 to 5 or 3 to 4 demonstration cases. We want to also work across the board, not only in OECD countries, but also in low and middle income countries to learn from all the kind of experiences on the ground. So the Mission Lab also will have a community angle and a sharing knowledge angle about how missions are set and how missions are run. So in 2021, we are setting up the lab, and in 2022, we're really looking forward to working together with the first cases on really the governance and operationalization of missions themselves. And what are those questions that are most interesting to us? And Philippe and Ben have already gone through them as well. So we are looking for, going to the next slide indeed, looking at these areas of governing missions, policy setting and implementation with very concrete problems that we have already seen emerging. Some of these things that I've already mentioned in terms of projectization, call specifics, procurement, working across different government bodies, but also engaging and connecting to different partners on the ground. So these are all things that we are also collecting methodologies or approaches on how to actually do better and how the OECD can support the countries on the ground on doing better. And the next 2 buckets of challenges that we have are connected to, also on the next slide, are connected to mission operationalization and contextual factors. So we also think that we need to look at specific missions and specific areas in different ways. We need different types of system mapping tools and systems approaches to also understand different contextual factors connected to the missions. For example, many missions are also dependent on cities, regions, and governments working together. So what are those vehicles that those mission portfolios actually become actionable and concrete on the ground? So these are some of the questions that the Mission Action Lab is trying to really approach and tackle in the upcoming years. If you're interested in our work and would like to participate, then please do get in touch with us and sign up on the kind of the broader missions community. Or if you have a case particular that would be interesting to use as a demonstration case, then also let us know as soon as possible. We are doing our selection in autumn for 2022 22 cases as soon as possible. And I think, especially in terms of time-wise, when we're moving into post-COVID period and recovery, this is the kind of the best time to really tackle the missions and use this time for the most ambitious and also impactful goals on the ground. Over to you, Chiara.
Thank you, Piret, for a presentation of the Missions Action Lab, soon to be launched. Thank you to Ben and Philippe for their previous presentations. And before we move into the very exciting panel, another attempt at WooClap, the question to you again, same as before, is which tools and methods do you use to engage a wide and diversified group of stakeholders in defining the mission? Feel free to answer this in your own time, since we know we have some technical issues, but we would love to hear your thoughts. Now, without any further ado, I'm very excited to launch the panel discussions. I'll hand it over to Angela to introduce the speakers.
Great, thank you, Chiara. Hello, everyone. My name is Angela Hansen, the OECD, and I work actually between several of the teams you heard from today on this topic. This topic has forced an organization, OECD is an organization with some silos like most organizations, and this is actually a really interesting initiative for the OECD and getting our different units working on missions, working together. So it's forced us as an organization to reorient as well. So that's been interesting to watch from the inside. But what I'm really interested in hearing from next is the implementation of missions and how that looks from different perspectives of people doing the work on the ground right now. A sign of a maturing practice and something that's moving beyond just the kind of mission theater and beyond the words is when people take these words into practice and figure out how this should actually be governed and how it should be implemented. And you're going to hear from speakers who are doing just that. So we'll hear from several different perspectives, and then we will have a discussion on some of the challenges that each of them are facing in their implementation of missions. So to start off today, we're going to first hear from Dr. Alexander Cook, who is the General Manager of the Missions Program in CSIRO, Australia's national science agency. Before joining CSIRO at the beginning of 2021, Alex spent 4 years in Europe, where he was the science attaché for the Australian Ministry of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. Alex has worked across a range of Australian government ministries and agencies responsible for science, research and innovation over the last 15 years, including advising the Science Minister and supporting several of Australia's chief scientists. So he's going to be telling us a bit today about what mission coordination and governance looks like from his perspective. The floor is yours, Alex.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this panel event, and good evening from Canberra. So I wanted to start by briefly giving you an overview of what CSIRO is, and then talk about our CSIRO mission model, noting that we'll go into the panel around some discussions around some of the specific challenges. So CSIRO is the abbreviation of the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. It's an RTO. It's an independent Australian federal government agency responsible for scientific research. Its chief role is to improve the economic and social performance of industry for the benefit of the community. The organisation has about 5,500 people working across Australia in a range of sites geographically spread all over the place. It undertakes research and development across a broad spectrum of disciplines, and it has a budget of around $1.8 billion in Australian money, so 1.2 billion euros a year. That money consists of 50-50 government sources and external sources. So CSIRO is focused on science for impact and doesn't engage in the basic scientific research, but it seeks to nurture and enable the national innovation system and commercialisation outcomes. And so it's specifically geared towards taking basic R&D and scientific activities and delivering impact more broadly. We deliver around $4.5 billion in Australian dollars of value per year to the Australian economy through a range of different innovations and inventions. We like to compare ourselves to the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft or the Canadian NRC, just to give you a picture of what the organisation's like. So what does the CSIRO mission model look like? So we, and some of these words will sound very familiar, having seen Philippe's presentation. So we consider CSIRO missions to be coordinated packages of projects, initiatives mobilising science, technology and innovation to address well-defined objectives related to a societal challenge. For us, they also span the innovation cycle from search and demonstration to market deployment. We crucially leave out the word policy in the description that we use due to the position that CSIRO occupies within the innovation landscape in Australia, where CSIRO doesn't have the ability to provide policy advice to inform policy. It needs to work with others to deliver those outcomes through influence. The CSIRO missions model differs from other approaches globally, particularly the European approaches, where we don't have a central pot of funding that's been allocated by a government to then allocate to researchers and innovators and businesses. We aim to actually crowd in the existing financial and other resources from industry, government, research and civil society stakeholders to scale our missions and to achieve impact. And because of that, we have an imperative to coordinate efforts across the innovation system. And we're trying to balance that off against an imperative for a market validation piece where we bring in external revenue for the organisation. This is a key characteristic of the missions model within the Australian landscape, is that we both have to achieve major mission objectives, but also bring in external revenue to the organisation. And this is a culmination of change that's been taking place over the last 4 years in CSIRO as part of a move to fewer, bigger things, where we're trying to move beyond individual transactional relationships with smaller end users, but actually big ticket activities to deliver major impact. And that's guiding the approach that we're taking with the missions framework. So I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the actual missions that we've got stood up. As I said, we've been working for 2 or 3 years to establish the framework. We've been talking to Mariana Mazzucato, UCL, others across the ecosystem globally to understand what the best approaches for missions would look like. We've been developing the missions framework as we fly it, is how we put it. So we've been learning as we go. But we've identified 12 individual mission candidates against 6 societal challenges, which are the biggest challenges that we think that are facing Australia. So these 12 candidate missions are where CSIRO thinks that we have the core science and technology capability and the cross-disciplinary engagement that could be scaled up to meet these national challenges. So the areas in which CSIRO has a core science and tech capability, we're not going to dabble in other areas just because they're interesting and of political interest for the government of the day. So some of these missions include ones with objectives like providing the science, technology and know-how to support our regions' governments to achieve their net zero targets. And it's a new one that we've been standing up, and hopefully we'll have some news about that in the coming months. Harnessing data to quantify and mitigate climate risk, supporting the creation of clean batteries and collaboration to end plastic waste. So they're just a few of our climate-related missions. But around 6 weeks ago, we got to the end of the first phase of our formal approval process with the missions framework, which is to get beyond the concept stage gate, the planning stage gate, and through to a launch stage gate within our framework, where the board of the CSIRO endorsed 4 missions to be launched. And that means that CSIRO has effectively decided to wear the risk of an implementation program that will last 5 to 7 years. So we've done all of the work in the background to build up some confidence that we can invest in a long-term project with a big, tangible and measurable outcome that crosses multiple disciplines. And so just to give you a sense of what they are, so we have a hydrogen industry mission, which aims to enable a globally competitive Australian hydrogen industry and to get to a target of H2 under $2 per kilo, which is the point at which hydrogen becomes price competitive with other forms of energy in the system. So this requires major activities across various parts of the organisation, as well as working with external stakeholders. We also have one on future protein, which aims to leverage increasing global demand for high quality protein to create new Australian products and earn revenue, And it has the objective of growing Australia's protein industry by $10 billion by 2025. So it's a measurable, tangible objective that we've set up. We have a third mission around trusted agri-foods with an objective to increase the value of Australian food exports and grow exports by $10 billion by 2030. And finally, a mission on drought resilience, which aims to reduce the negative impacts of drought by 30% by 2030. So as I said, we're in the coming months planning to launch the Towards Net Zero mission, which will aim to have a regional focus on delivering tools and abilities for individual regions to achieve their net zero targets and for our individual governments to achieve their net zero targets. And so we'll have a lot more news around those ones in particular in the coming weeks. So I might just leave it there and be interested to keep the conversation going around some of the implementation challenges that we're facing, because we have quite a few, and I'd be particularly interested to hear from others around how they're going in their own systems. So thanks, Angela.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. It's very, very interesting, particularly thinking about the kind of non-centralized European model, contrasting that and that creating this imperative to crowd in, as you mentioned. So that's a really interesting difference that may actually be a bit of an advantage in implementing missions in your context. So that's a really interesting factor that you brought out there. I would suggest to all of the participants to ask questions in the Q&A. That can be specific questions for each of the panelists or more general questions that we will get to at the end. But to hear from a different perspective, we're going to go to Norway next. We're going to hear from Philip Lorentzen, who is a special advisor at the Research Council of Norway. He has been at the RCN for 10 years, mainly focused on R&D in industry and the development of the Norwegian innovation system. Philip previously worked in industry on strategy and business development. He holds a BA in business organization from Scotland and don't know which school there, sorry, and an MBA from the Norwegian School of Economics. He's going to be speaking about kind of leveling up and scaling up of mission orientation in the Norwegian context. The floor is yours, Philip.
Thank you very much, Angela. Well, first of all, thanks for the presentations earlier. I recognize a lot of the issues they has been speaking about. And on one of the slides from Philippe, he showed our pilot e-scheme. And that's an interesting case, and it's also described in the case study performed in the previous 2-year project. So I can recommend having a look at that because you get a lot more details there. But that scheme developed in a more of a organic way, so to speak. We as a research agency, we have not. We're not strangers to strategic SDI policy. That's most agencies do that, over a long time. But this scheme developed because there were some entrepreneurs in some of our agencies here in Norway, and they made an overseas trip together, and they discovered that if we link together our tools, we can get a better service and also better results from our different tools and schemes. So they linked together and they created this pilot e-scheme, and that is now an ongoing since 2016 interagency scheme where we have an annual call. And they are targeted calls for development of technology all the way out to solutions. Some of them being, for instance, electric ferries. We have lots of fjords in Norway, and we have a lot of ferries going across them, and we need to reduce the carbon emissions from those. So they are developing, and some of these ferries are now in operation already. So this scheme came bottom up, so it came from individuals in the agencies and were developed with funds from the agencies which were not earmarked for this. So we received support from the ministries, but not actual directed funding, and they are then put into practice directly. And in the sort of nomenclature of missions, we can say these are accelerated missions. So we accelerate the development of the technologies this way. So in this case study, which was led by Philippe, we got two recommendations. The first one was to scale up. That means using the same concept in new and other areas. So we've done that. One of them is, for instance, to go into the healthcare area, where we have a lack of cooperation between the health providers, industry, and also different other public sector actors who are practitioners of healthcare. So these, and what we find is that we can use the same concept, but there are clear differences. I mean, the actors who are involved are different. So we, instead of having an environmental agency and an innovation and R&D agency like in Pilot E, we need to have municipalities involved. We need to have hospitals, healthcare providers involved in this sort of scheme. And that means that we have to adapt to the way of working, because the incentives are different, the actors are different, and cultures between the different agencies and actors are different. And that means that we need to be adaptable. Also, the financing of this is different, where this is built on the experience from Pilot E, and the actual the Ministry for Health and Welfare has funded this initiative with specific money. So that means we have also done this. There are initiatives on transport, on the bioeconomy and that sort of stuff. So they are all slightly different, but built on the same sort of structure. The second recommendation is a level up, and that brings it into the territory which Alex was talking about, where there's a central sort of initiative, and this is something that has few traditions in Norway. We have a very strong sectoral government structure, where the different sectors have very different objectives and autonomy. But we see that we need to the big challenges, Norway being a very oil and gas dependent country, we need to transform our industrial structure and have to have new industries come up and to replace that. And that requires a whole of government approach. And that will be the next level. So the government will release next year a new long-term plan for research and higher education. And we are arguing that this should be a platform for transitions, and have a broad political agreement to have a transition sort of initiative built into that plan. So that will be more of a transformational missions policy tool. So we can talk a lot more about the implementation issues later, but I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Angela.
Great, thank you very much, Philip. It's very interesting to hear about the leveling up, scaling up, and I hope we get to dive into that a bit more, particularly around the what you've done for bottom-up actions. That's really, really key, I think. So hopefully we can dive a bit more into that. Before we do that, we're going to Vietnam. So we're going to hear from Ida Utikala, who works as an innovation officer at the UNDP Vietnam Accelerator Lab, focusing on strategic and governance innovation, integrating and implementing systems change approaches as part of the UNDP Deep Demonstration Initiative. She holds a master's degree from London School of Economics and Political Science in Development Management, and a bachelor's degree from University of Helsinki in Political Science. So she's going to be speaking about the role of enhancing, abolishing, layering on top of existing coordination systems, and some of the specificities of coordination of missions and governance of missions between agencies such as UNDP working in low and middle income countries. There was a question in the chat as well about what is the role of development and humanitarian organizations in missions. So just in time to dive into that, I will hand it over to Ida.
Thanks so much, Angela, and thank you so much for having me here today. Great presentations already, and a lot of it really resonated with our work as well. And it's such an important topic of discussing actually how to implement missions in practice, because as Piret was saying, this is where the rubber hits the road, and it's a real innovation once it's being, once the ideas have been turned into practice. So really great opportunity to share. I'll just briefly provide you perhaps some background about the kind of work that we're doing, the challenge space that we're operating in, before kind of going deeper into those questions you were mentioning. And I think this kind of a mission-oriented approaches or systems approaches really come for UNDP as an organization from the notion that some of the most critical social and environmental challenges are way too complex, way too fast moving, needing new types of approaches that currently are the development organizations like ourselves has not been designed for initially. And so we're increasingly seeing what we call the relevance gap between things that we are implementing where we are now and looking at the challenges that we're trying to address. So that was kind of the realization why the Accelerator Lab Network was initiated in 2019, and now with over 90 countries having the lab in the world. But in addition to that, we're lucky to have one of the labs actually in Vietnam. So we're working very closely with the lab on these topics. But in addition to that, in 2020, UNDP Vietnam became part of 9 country offices of UNDP around the world in what we call deep demonstrations. And this is where perhaps these mission-oriented approaches and systems approaches started to really integrate those. And the initiative of deep demonstrations is really grounded in the notion that that we can't have just single point solutions or short-term approaches. And this was mentioned before in addressing some of these challenges. And that's how we've been starting to explore how can we actually facilitate these new types of approaches in an organization that's designed based on very different incentive structures, very different ways of operating, and what would it mean for UNDP to start designing and implementing development interventions in new ways. And so I will get back to that in a minute, but I'll first just share with you an example and the topic that we're currently grappling with. So for those that are not familiar with Vietnam's context, it might be helpful to outline one example, and then the topic that we're working on in trying to implement the mission approach is that that Vietnam's development trajectory as it is right now is that we've seen rapid growth, which has been really inclusive, but has come with a high cost of the environment. There's a lot of environmental pollution. Vietnam is actually now ranked 4th in the world of plastic waste. And this is kind of the challenge framework that we're working with, where we're looking at how to actually address the current logics of the linear economy and what would that mean from the systems perspective. For us, a key actor in this space is also the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which are the backbone of Vietnam's economy. One of the key actors, therefore, in this system. And the additional challenge layering to this kind of a context of a country that's rapidly moving in the development trajectory is that we're also facing rapidly changing financial framework for the SDGs. And we're seeing constantly declining direct grant ODA, declining tax to GDP ratio. lack of public financing, and to somewhat misaligned priorities. So in that sense, the challenge space we're looking at is that how can we also leverage existing resources in new ways and in better ways. And this is kind of one of the key core things also for our mission-oriented or systems approaches that we're designing as part of the deep demonstrations work, is that actually, if you look it through the financial lens, it's not the question that there is no financing or investment flooding to Vietnam. It is, you know, the FDI is rapidly increasing, but how do we actually leverage that to finance a systems transformation when it comes to countries' transition to a circular economy? So for us, this topic really came about as part of our portfolio sense making as well. And I think this is also a really key core kind of a organizational process for us that we're integrated as part of our core now. And portfolio sense making for us is this kind of an iterative process to learn rapidly and extract insights from our current projects to see what we're actually currently doing. And that goes back to, again, leveraging the existing resources within UNDP, looking at our whole project portfolio, seeing what already exists, and then kind of through different types of structured discussions in the space, trying to understand where are the acceleration opportunities. And for us, that really circular economy came strongly, and also the notion that we need to be anticipatory and agile and adaptive as an organization to these fast-paced challenges that we're seeing. And this sense making is in a way a core for us. And we realized through our sense making in 2019, we've now had 2 sense making sessions, that in fact we're doing a lot on circular economy already. But the key thing is that these interventions for us we have great projects, but they are not necessarily learning from each other. We don't necessarily have those key interlinkages that we would need, and therefore that begs the question, okay, how can we actually design our own interventions in a way that are more coherent, learning from each other, and have a more of a systems kind of an impact. And that then ties into the other point, which is that, of course, as the UNDP, we're even looking at circular economy in Vietnam. We have a lot of different actors, even CSIRO here, Norway. We have a lot of actors doing fantastic work already, but this kind of comes to the basic question of development work. How do we coordinate? But that's more of a question, actually, how do we learn from each other? And how do we learn effectively? And how can we translate that learning into action? And that's something that we're trying to facilitate as UNDP, trying to create and understand how would a portfolio of interventions in this context look like. What is the, and then I know we're going to be talking about some challenges, which of course is great, but then it ties to the question of, you know, what are the monitoring and evaluation mechanisms? What are the partnership mechanisms? What is the definition of a success when you look at a portfolio? So all these questions are things that we're currently asking ourselves, and what these deep demonstrations have really given us is this space to explore these things. And so I'm really excited to share maybe more with you as part of the next questions. I'm sure there'll be additional ones that tie into these. So over to you, Angela.
Great, thank you, Ida. Really glad that you stressed this role of sense making and learning, and how that is a basis for the kind of coordination that's needed as part of missions. It's really, really key. We're going to hear from one more perspective, and if you have questions for our panelists, feel free to add them in the Q&A. There's some great ones coming in already, so we'll draw from those for the panel discussion as well. I'd like to hear from one more before we go into the panel discussion, and Anne-Marie Amunk-Ries is going to be talking about work happening in Denmark. So specifically, Anne-Marie is the Executive Vice President at the Innovation Fund Denmark. She's currently in charge of the new Danish mission program, focusing on PTX, carbon capture, agriculture and food, circular economy, plastic and textiles. The project is funded with €1 billion, I hope that's right, in 2021, correct me if that's wrong. Anne-Marie's background is in public and private sector, mostly focused on policy analysis, policy development, innovation systems, public-private partnership. She has a PhD in economics. Over to you, Anne-Marie. What's happening in Denmark?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for letting me join. I only signed up this morning, so I'm happy you could squeeze me in. It's a great program. Great that you're conducting this webinar. So just a very short brief on what is happening in Denmark. The Danish government, so I'm working with the Innovation Fund Denmark. So we are a funding agency, and currently we're actually working on the first and real mission-driven program in Denmark. So it's really the first time we've done big partnerships, but this is supposed to be something else. It started out with the government issuing a new green research strategy, focusing on sort of several green big issues. And from that, 4 missions have been pointed out, you can say, and as Angela said, it's 100 billion euros, 700 million kroner, that we now within this year have to place in a safe and good and effective manner for these missions. So we are. It's all happening very fast, so we're doing as good as we can. So the way we do it this year is that we have asked the stakeholders, so universities, industry, cluster organizations, to define roadmaps. So we actually made a call for roadmaps within these 4 missions. So we have not really defined very much other than the topic, and that came from the government, and then they have handed in roadmaps. So several roadmaps have come in for each mission, and so we're now selecting between these roadmaps and making the second phase call, which is then a call for partnerships. This is difficult because we had hoped maybe that the roadmaps would have pointed to more like, okay, where do we see the impact? But we really see that's difficult. What is also very difficult is to have all stakeholders involved at the same time. We see that there's some battling going on there between, especially on the research side, because there's a lot of money here, and researchers want their research funded, just to be very blunt up front here. So we now have to select between these roadmaps, maybe combine some of them and issue this call in August, and then it all has to be finalized within the end of the year, and then evaluated because maybe we can do it in a different way next time. So it goes without saying that to develop a program and get the money out working within a year is not a long period of time, but we do a little bit of rapid prototyping here. So I'm very curious to hear how this all works in other countries. Obviously, there's sort of one matter of like, where is the impact? How do we choose the right people to be involved? But also very much the governance structure, because we've done many big partnerships, but what is the right governance structure for this kind of work? And another question that I'm really intrigued by is, and we've been looking also to Norway and other countries, how do we combine sort of science policy with more demand side policies and all that, in order for it not just to be yet another big partnership, but something that really goes across. So I think that is probably the hardest part of this mission-driven thing going on. Yeah, so I think this is all I wanted to say. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. In addition to all the other complexities around the governance, you also have this time challenge in front of you. So wish you luck with that. Speaking of challenges, I want to hear from each of our panelists about the biggest challenges they're facing right now. I think many on the call would say that it would be quite delighted to be where you're at in terms of having these missions in place and being at a point of implementing and setting up governance structures. But as we know, that's not the end of the story. That's often the beginning of the story in implementation. So I'm curious from each of your perspectives, what is the biggest implementation challenge that you're facing right now as you're getting into the details of how missions should be governed in practice? And if you could give about 1 to 2 minutes each, we'll go in the order that we went in the panel, and then we'll go into some of the specifics that you brought up in your presentations. Floor is yours, Alex.
Okay, thanks, Angela. And I might just start by responding to some of the points that were raised, because they're all exactly the same issues that we've been dealing with. 2 ways in which we've gotten around those is that we're not a research funding agency. So people don't come to us looking for rents. So that changes the discussion, instantly changes the discussion. The other thing is that the board for CSIRO, the main decision makers, said, you will not launch until you're ready, as opposed to you must launch because we have a political imperative. So we were actually given the permission to take the time. So our movement to getting to a launch phase required us to take the time to do that extra, the architecture around the governance and so on. The big challenge for us is around scaling up. So we've done all of this hard work to get to a launch phase. We've committed to a 5 to 7 year program of work. Our mission leads, so we have individual leaders for each of our 12 missions, and they have a small team around them. They, in some respects, feel like they've done all the hard work now and they can coast for 5 years. That's being a bit too pejorative, but they don't have a set of signposts to get to the mission objective beyond an impact pathway and a program logic. So questions like what the incentives are, what the ongoing monitoring and evaluation framework looks like, how would we know when to intervene if the programs of work that are underneath the mission are not going to deliver the outcome? When are those decision-making points? So they're probably the major implementation challenges for us.
Philip?
Okay, well, there are many implementation challenges. I don't know which one is the biggest one, but I'll mention. I mean, we have worked a lot, bottom-up and interagency work, and this has worked really well because when you have an entrepreneurial sort of spirit in the team and it's a starts with a fairly small initiative, you get a lot of formal issues and culture issues because you have this drive from the people who work on it. Now that we're scaling up, we see that there are, between the agencies, very different cultures, very different ways of working. There are small formal legal issues, like, for instance, the Research Council of Norway, we have a tradition to publicize the applicants for the names of applicants for our grants. Now, the Innovation Agency, they don't do this. So we have this big discussion of whether we should publicize this list or not. Okay, this is a very small issue, but it's something that's an example of one of many things that make things difficult as you scale them up, because in a small scale pilot like pilot E, you can get around these issues. So those are the same with governance structures, like you mentioned, Anna-Marie, is you can, as long as you keep it, on a practical level, it works. But now, if ministries, politicians, everything gets involved, it gets more complicated and more prestige gets into it and that sort of thing. So that is our biggest issue: how to be able to scale this fairly successful scheme up to a really bigger level without getting a lot of formal and prestige issues involved in it. So that's what we're working on now, and I think it's important to be aware of those things. Well, we're working on a lot of things where we can harmonize, legal issues and that sort of stuff. And also we need to connect up to the European Union emissions. What is the role between the national missions and the European or even global missions we should be involved with? And that's also very important to get the most out of all these initiatives. Okay.
A really interesting comment there about the prestige element. There was a mention in the chat about a lot of innovation and missions happening despite the organization kind of in the dark, then how do you create those spaces for that and scale that up when it has these this prestige tied to it? So it's a organizational, cultural challenge there. How about Ida? What challenges are you facing right now?
Yeah, thanks, and really echo what previous speakers also mentioned. I think, yeah, just for our side, there are of course many challenges. I think for just starting, if we look kind of from the sensing that I was talking about, then we in a way through our current framework, going through the reframing and the positioning when we do create the portfolio of interventions through consultative processes, and then go into the transforming part where we do engage with partners and start deploying the portfolio. There's a lot of challenges in a way in each of these sections and parts. But for us, I guess a concrete example could be, and something that could be shared as an example, is that in Da Nang we engaged again on the topic of circular economy, and specifically looking at plastics and solid waste management in a way as a subsystem of circular economy transition and what it means actually in the city context. And we created 2 different portfolios. One of them was focused on the current system, the compliance. We actually found that a lot of the legislation, a lot of the policies, regulations were already there. There's a lot of things in place, but what is basically lacking is more of the implementation of the existing policies and regulations. We then also created a more of a transformative portfolio around green consumption, which also is a longer term selection of interventions and areas to intervene, which aims to maybe go a bit deeper in this kind of a behavioral change needed to facilitate a circular economy transition at the city level. And what we in a way found was that we designed these portfolios also together with different partners through a long consultative process, engaging businesses, NGOs, citizen, the waste management system in itself and its actors. And we in a way underestimated the need for creating a movement and creating the kind of a buy-in and necessary level of awareness of what it actually takes. So in a way that kind of put us back to thinking, actually, how do we start creating a movement around this issue in the city context? Because these things are only able to be driven forward if you have the local engagement, if you have the critical mass at the local level. And so what we then in a way started doing is that we implement a circular economy hub, which was focusing on incubating business ideas on circular economy, companies that wanted to adopt circular economy business practices, which then in a way led to a point where the PPC in Da Nang wanted to actually start developing a roadmap. And they wanted to develop a roadmap for circular economy, engaging different parts of the local government. And then we are now supporting the local government in designing that together with different stakeholders. And I guess the cross departmental or ministerial nature of creating such roadmap is then another challenge. And that's something in a way that we are seeing, especially in the context of Vietnam, of how do you bring different departments and ministries together around a shared mission. And I think this is the core of the mission-oriented innovation and mission-oriented work. And how do you facilitate these discussions across these silos and incentives that are already existing? So that's a process now that we're facilitating at the city level, whilst working at the national level on the decree development, supporting our work at the city level. But I think for the critical part is, in a way, when we do look at portfolios and developing these, is that there's a whole heap of learning once you start implementing the portfolio, and really unexpected things. And you need to have a portfolio that's able to adapt while you learn these things, that, okay, this is not working, we need to pivot. Okay, let's test this out and pivot. And I think the problem is that currently our mechanisms and the kind of prototype base of development work doesn't really allow that. So this is something that we're trying to introduce and work with partners and also see, because for us as the organization is of course that we work with donors, and that donors are also bound to these similar types of designing projects and implementing projects and so on. So this is perhaps some of our learnings, and I'm happy to share more, but I would love to give the floor to other speakers as well.
Yeah, really interesting with especially related to this problem of mission lock-in and what you brought up about keeping a portion of that portfolio for the unexpected, where a mission might need to shift or change strategies. Really important point there. Anne-Marie, what challenges are you facing right now with implementation governance in Denmark?
Yeah, right now, because we're choosing between different roadmaps, it's really actually also measuring the impact of the different roadmaps, because they not as much as we had hoped are they showing the impact, because we're lacking standardized ways of measuring, and just to make things a little bit more complex, it's not only greenhouse gas reduction, it's also actually competitiveness for Danish companies that is put into the pot. So you're actually comparing apples and bananas here, although it sort of course there's some positive influence from one to each other. So that is one conflict. Then there's, as Ida also mentioned, this conflict between staying focused and staying on the roadmap, and then still have the agility to, the world is changing all the time, and then how do we incentivize that people stay within the partnership, but also new companies, new researchers come in, and how can we actually, which is not a big tradition, then stop projects that are not going as well, because that is certainly not easy, as you all know, but I think we really need a method for that, both legally and culturally, because we don't have a big tradition for that. Then there's also the whole idea of getting more, because we are a research funding agency, we do work quite a lot with companies, but we still have to incentivize companies being more involved, because the money we were granted is certainly not enough to solve all these big mission problems. So how do we get industry more involved? That is another issue. Oh God, that's a lot. Then there's the whole, as we come from a technology tradition, there's the whole notion of having the funding roadmap involved as well. I mean, where should money come from, but also implementation. How do we get the consumer behavior regulation and all that included, so we don't just have fantastic technology ideas that would not in itself solve the problem. So that's just a little bit of what's on the list. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. That's a lot on the list already. So several of you mentioned that the work that you do involves many stakeholders, sometimes different levels of government. And one of the questions that we're thinking about is, if you're an organization that's in charge of stewarding or coordinating missions, or doing some sense making or learning or funding, how do you decide how you intervene in the implementation of the mission? How do you decide what should be your role in that? And I think maybe to start us off, Alex, if you want to weigh in on that, and I know others probably have a lot to say about that as well, but if you could tell us a bit about that from your perspective to start us off.
Indeed. So, I mean, I run what is called the Missions Program Office. So we are the central office that coordinates and is effectively the gatekeeper for individual missions to get that approval process. So we have the architecture there. We've effectively been given the mandate by the CEO and the board to be that gatekeeper function and allow us to intervene. That leaves me feeling very exposed. So we've also been setting up the governance and architecture and program logic to explain what it looks like to be successful and to get to those various points. But I guess the most interesting thing is, within our organization, missions will drive 1/3 of our external revenue. That's of our activity. That's the aspiration, is it'll be a change program to occupy 1/3. So that means 2/3 of CSIRO's activity is not mission related. So we see missions as a tool to deliver impact. and there are other tools that can deliver impact. And we're looking at the way in which we would give alternative pathways to various activities outside the missions framework if they're not going to get in past the various stage gates, and trying to articulate what that looks like. So that's the big piece of work that we're looking at the moment, is how do you identify that point in time at which you know that this is not going to be a mission like the other missions. It's actually going to be a spin-out company, or it's going to be just a normal research discovery that will lead to an outcome. So that's where we're focused on the interventions.
Really interesting. Philip, it looks like you want to weigh in as well.
I was thinking about this. When you formulate missions, and we have these projects, and we have often funding related to the missions, there's a lot going on outside the missions programs, which is relevant to the missions. So I think it's important to try to monitor or to catch, or have a broad portfolio or an overview of what's going on in this field, because otherwise you might be working on something that's already being done elsewhere, or you're missing stuff. So that is I think that's important. We at the Research Council, for different reasons, have started this portfolio management system as an alternative to program management, so to speak. So we try to have objectives and try to see our complete portfolio and have tags on every project. So we assemble a portfolio across all programs, across all budgets, which are relevant to a certain topic or a problem. This is not perfect, and it should be implemented across different agencies and whatever, but it's a start. And I think that could be a good idea to explore for other people as well, to see if that's a way forward. But I won't say we've perfected this. We've started in the last couple of years, and then we'll see where it brings us.
And Ida, you've been doing, of course, a lot of work on portfolios as well. And I want to ask a bit about how you leverage that tool when you have to do reframing of a mission, or if the mission changes, you need to change direction or engage people in different ways. How has this portfolio approach and this learning approach helped you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, reframing is really a key, I think, when it comes to the portfolio design. And that was really the starting point, in effect, of our inquiry into circular economy. And for us, we have been working with a company called Snow Cone and Haystack, where we use their studio approach to unpack, in a way, of the challenge space. Because I think the first step really is to understand the challenge space and the problem space that you're working with, and the kind of underlying drivers and dynamics in that space quite well, to be able to then design for that. And for us, and actually going back to the previous question a little bit, the question in a way was first, like, as a design question, like, do we design a portfolio for an organization or for a challenge? And I think that's a critical one. I think oftentimes organizations design for themselves and looking at, okay, where are we best positioned to do, not necessarily understanding what's already happening or how to leverage existing interventions on the ground. But this makes sense for us now. We're doing this. But instead, we took an approach of really trying to unpack what does it mean for Vietnam. What is it? What are the different actors actually doing, and what are they trying to achieve? And for us, the reframing question was, in a way, came through the studio approach, which is a team-based and design-led approach, where in a way we brought together people from very different backgrounds. We had architects, we had journalists, we had economists, we had biologists, all looking at the challenge question from different angles. And that's in a way critical, because we're trying to understand the very different drivers behind the circular economy or the current linear economy model. Like what are the actual challenges there? So through this, actually, we learned mainly 3 key things. One of them is that currently in Vietnam, when you look at the who has the mandate for circular economy transition, you know, we're looking at a Ministry of Environment. It's an obvious one from a certain perspective, looking at the plastics challenge, looking at the increasing pollution. But if we are really talking about a circular economy transition, we're looking at a very different type of transition, not only one that addresses environmental pollution or, you know, trying to react to increasing waste, which is an issue and which has to happen, but we also need interventions that are shared across the ministries again, and that have that really strive towards changing the fundamental logics of how the economy and the markets work in Vietnam to be able to start transitioning to a circular economy. So we need a whole heap of other interventions, whole heap of other actors that in a way we haven't traditionally engaged with. So we started to ask very new types of questions around what are the economic incentives and who is losing and who is winning, because that's a very important question, trying to understand the shift. And so what the next kind of a realization in a way for us was that that actually the circular economy transition should be treated as an emergency. We don't have time to wait. We should treat it as a similar emergency as we did with COVID for Vietnam's case. And actually, it's a very good learning because Vietnam has, you know, has dealt with the COVID pandemic extremely well. One of the top countries in Asia. Only through these recent waves, which still in comparison to other countries, you know, are very low, but have been increasing now. But what are those underlying mechanisms that made the government to act in a rapid way, that made it so agile, that actually broke through all the silos in such a rapid response? So we need to learn from those types of interventions in that case. And so the final learning for us was that, in fact, the circular economy transition is about future-proofing Vietnam. It's about managing and hedging risks, and you need to kind of pitch it from that perspective. You need to see it from that perspective, that actually currently there are only that actually it is needed in terms of as a vehicle to build resilience towards future shocks, and actually getting even economic incentives, that it has economic incentives, you know, bared within it with the constantly increasing investments going to low carbon development. So that was kind of the final one, and we used this very collaborative method to start, you know, reframing this transition, in fact, from this perspective rather than seeing it from purely an environmental perspective.
Thank you. And as always happens in these discussions, is we always seem to lack enough time to dig into the topics to the depth we would like to, and that's the case here. Unfortunately, we're about to wrap up. There are a few questions we didn't get to about how how you manage an organization against this kind of projectification of missions. So we didn't get a chance to dive into that, which I know all of you have something to say. There was a question about evaluation of missions that came up in the chat, and how do you decide how many missions you can focus on at one time, and does it dilute the other missions? So these kind of questions that have come up, which unfortunately we will not be able to address today, but these are going to be added to our Mission Action Lab research agenda, because I think these are very interesting when we talk about implementation. But I thank all of the panelists today for giving these insights on how do you take something very glossy and shiny as a mission and turn it into a practice with governance structures around it, so that the missions can be not only sustainable, but also flexible. So I appreciate everyone's contribution to this topic today. I appreciate everyone for the great questions, which we didn't get a chance to get to, but we will take them in addition to the WooClap insights informing the research agenda of the Mission Action Lab. So the next step with the Mission Action Lab is we will be launching at the end of this year, and these conversations are greatly important for informing exactly how that Action Lab supports you in your implementation. Thanks to my colleagues also from the OECD for sharing their work and their insights on missions, and for jumping in on a cross directorate initiative like the Mission Action Lab. It's very exciting work, and more exciting work to come from the OECD and from everyone who's participated today. Once again, thank you very much, and hope to see you again soon.